Up till now in the course on getting things done, we've looked at different management mechanisms that have come from classical management theory and new public management theory about how to implement things, how to close the gap between the ideas that we have in development and the actual results that we see. That sometimes we think that this is about strengthening the central mechanisms in the state, sometimes about decentralizing, sometimes about contracting out, sometimes about having targets, sometimes it's about creating motivational incentives. But the question is kind of what tool do we use? What tool do we actually employ? What lever do we try to pull? Because pulling all of them at the same time can create some kind of a Frankenstein. So being able to work out which tool you use is really difficult, especially when you look at the many experiences that have tried to create bureaucracies, and the bureaucracies have turned out more of a problem than a solution, or where you've had privatization initiatives, and those have turned out to be things that actually shouldn't have been done because of the context, because of limitations in capabilities, etc. So we then had a discussion about capability traps and said, well, actually, this is a common thing that oftentimes you see implementation gaps, both because there's problems with the choice of policy and of implementation modalities. That oftentimes you have isomorphism where governments or agencies or organizations are copying what other people tell them is the right thing to do, and then they find that that thing is actually not the right thing to do, but they can't really get out of that. They're doing it so that they get continued support and legitimacy. They maintain that, but they don't get functionality. That oftentimes this comes also with premature load bearing, where the thing that they're adopting is coming from somewhere else, and somewhere else had more capability, and they don't have that capability, so therefore you kind of just, the bridge falls down. So you think that, whatever your mechanism is that you're putting in place, your new policy, your new management mechanism, it's going to bridge you from where you are, where things aren't great, to kind of where you want to get to. You put the bridge there, you start traveling over it, boom, doesn't work, doesn't hold you, premature load bearing, you're in trouble. So then we kind of said, well, PDI is a way to kind of think about this. Where you have a complex problem, you don't really know what's going on. The idea about how to get out of something is both uncertain and unclear, and you know anything you do is going to be a risk. PDI says, well, why don't you start with the problem where you are, then why don't you iterate, and why don't you kind of learn and find what works in your context rather than kind of being sold on it at the beginning. Now, in the next few sessions, we're going to be going into a lot of detail about the dynamics of PDIA. And there's kind of three dimensions that we're going to look at. One is, how does PDIA think about contextual factors? Contextual factors often get in the way of getting things done. How do they think about finding the right content for your context? And then how do you think about the kinds of people who need to be involved in the process of doing this? So in the session that I'm reviewing today, we discussed context, and we said context matters. We all know that context matters. Everyone says that context matters. That's probably one of the greatest achievements and advantages of development in the last 20 years is people have started to say, the context matters. The question I raised in the class is, what about the context matters? What is it that matters, and how do we see it, and how do we take it seriously, and how do we assess it properly? I say that there's kind of four things that I look at generically in a context. Because development is about change, I kind of say, what is it about a context that tells me the type of space for change we have, both the shape and the size of that space? And there's four things I look at. One, how disrupted is the context? How much are people saying, gee, we have a problem and we need to change? Second thing is, how strong are the incumbent mechanisms? You're never, ever, ever doing change in a context where there's nothing there already. So how influential are the things that are there already? And a lot of these things are kind of like icebergs. They have norms, and they have cultural roots that are very deep, and you can't see them, and you try to hit them with the new law, and then you find the new law is actually just shifted out by the old way of doing things. The third thing is kind of how legitimate are the new things? So in a context, if you're trying to go from one thing to the other thing, do you have other things? Are there other things that people have looked at, that have considered, that have tried? So if you say, well, let's try another thing, they say, yeah, we've seen that. We've tried that. We think we could pull it off. We think it's a good idea. Or are you just proposing other things from the outside where people are saying, we don't know if we're like Sweden. We don't know if we're like Australia. The third thing, the fourth thing that I look at then is just kind of, the alignment of agents. Are agents aligned behind the status quo and behind the incumbent ways of doing things, or is there a growing alignment behind new things? We looked at a couple of cases in the class to look at these things and to see how oftentimes these kinds of factors either get in the way or facilitate the kind of change that we're thinking about. So the next class asks, well, how do you see these? How do you see these factors? How do you determine how strong incumbents are? How do you determine who really is behind change and who is not behind change? Because we know that these things are hard questions, and sometimes you can't analyze them from the outside. So that's what we'll see next time around. Thank you very much.